A entitled heir mocks a teacher's low salary. Years later, she decides his fate. In the bustling city of Oakville, Mrs. Evelyn Bennett walked briskly towards the community center, her graying hair pulled back in a tidy bun. The center had become her life's work since retiring from her teaching career at Oakville High School. As she approached the entrance, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing the smirking face of Alex Hartman, one of her former students and now a wealthy corporate tycoon. Well, if it isn't Mrs. Bennett, Alex drawled. Still slumming it in this dump, I see. Mrs. Bennett fixed him with a steady gaze. Hello, Alex. I see success hasn't made you any kinder. Alex's smirk faded. Kindness is for the weak, Mrs. B. Power and money are what matter in this world. He revved the engine. Speaking of which, I've got a new development project that's going to put this little center of yours out of business. Progress waits for no one. With that, he sped off, leaving Mrs. Bennett standing in a cloud of exhaust. She sighed, shaking her head. Alex had always been a challenging student, but she had hoped he would grow out of his entitled ways. It seemed that hope had been misplaced. Squaring her shoulders, she entered the center, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. 25 years earlier, Mrs. Bennett stood at the front of her classroom, watching as her students filed in for another day of learning. Her eyes settled on Alex Hartman, slouched in the back row, his expensive sneakers propped up on the desk. Alex, she called out. Feet on the floor, please. Alex rolled his eyes, but complied. Whatever you say, Mrs. B. As the lesson began, Mrs. Bennett couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Alex and some of her other students. While he sported designer clothes and the latest gadgets, others wore hand-me-downs and carried second-hand books. The inequality was glaring, but Mrs. Bennett was determined to provide the best education she could to all her students, regardless of their background. After class, Alex approached her desk, a smug grin on his face. You know, Mrs. B, you could probably afford some nicer clothes if you got a real job instead of wasting your time teaching a bunch of losers. Mrs. Bennett met his gaze, unflinching. I'm exactly where I want to be, Alex. Helping students learn and grow is the most rewarding job I could ask for. Alex scoffed. Yeah, right. Good luck with that. He sauntered out of the classroom, leaving Mrs. Bennett to wonder if she would ever be able to reach him. Fast forward to the Oakville High School reunion, 20 years after Alex's graduation. Mrs. Bennett, now retired, mingled with former students, catching up on their lives and achievements. As she listened to their stories, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the role she had played in shaping their futures. Suddenly, a hush fell over the room as Alex Hartman made his entrance, flanked by a pair of bodyguards. He strode through the crowd, his expensive suit and flashy watch drawing envious stares. Well, if it isn't my favorite teacher, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Still living paycheck to paycheck, Mrs. B? Mrs. Bennett smiled politely. I'm doing just fine, Alex. It's good to see you. Alex laughed. Yeah, I'm sure you are. Teaching must be so fulfilling, scraping by on a measly salary while people like me run the world. He turned to address the crowd. Hey everyone, let's take a moment to appreciate Mrs. Bennett. She taught us all the important life skills, like how to be poor and irrelevant. A few uncomfortable laughs echoed through the room, but Mrs. Bennett held her head high. Success isn't just about money, Alex. It's about making a difference in people's lives. Alex rolled his eyes. Keep telling yourself that, Mrs. B. Meanwhile, I'll be over here, living the dream. With that, he sauntered off, leaving a trail of whispers in his wake. Mrs. Bennett shook her head, saddened by Alex's lack of empathy. She could only hope that one day, he would learn the true meaning of success. In the years following the reunion, Mrs. Bennett threw herself into her new project, the Oakville Community Center. With the help of volunteers and donations, she transformed an abandoned building into a beacon of hope for the underprivileged. The center offered after-school programs, job training, and a safe space for those in need. One evening, as Mrs. Bennet was locking up, she noticed a familiar black car parked across the street. Alex Hartman stepped out, his face unreadable. "I heard about your little project," he said, approaching her. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. You've managed to create something out of nothing." Mrs. Bennet smiled. "Thank you, Alex. That means a lot." Alex's expression hardened. "Don't get too comfortable, though. I've got plans for this neighborhood, and your little center doesn't fit into them." Mrs. Bennet's smile faded. "What do you mean?" "I mean, progress waits for no one, Mrs. B. My company is buying up property all over this area. We're going to build luxury condos, high-end shops, and office spaces. It's time for this neighborhood to enter the 21st century." Mrs. Bennet's heart sank. "But what about the people who live here? The ones who rely on the center?" Alex shrugged. "They'll have to find somewhere else to go. It's just business." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Bennet to grapple with the implications of his words. She knew she couldn't let the center be destroyed, but how could she stand up to someone as powerful as Alex Hartman? As news of Alex's development plan spread, the community center buzzed with anxiety. Mrs. Bennet called an emergency meeting, inviting all those who had been impacted by the center's programs. "I know many of you are worried about the future of the center," she began, looking out at the sea of concerned faces. "But I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to keep this place running." A hand shot up from the crowd. It was Jasmine, a young woman who had found a new path in life thanks to the center's job training program. "But how can we fight someone like Alex Hartman?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's got money and power on his side." Mrs. Bennet smiled reassuringly. "We have something far more powerful, Jasmine. We have each other. This community has always been stronger together, and that's how we'll get through this." Another hand raised, this time belonging to Marcus, a teenager who had discovered his passion for art through the center's after-school classes. "What can we do to help, Mrs. B?" he asked, determination in his eyes. Mrs. Bennet's heart swelled with pride. "We start by showing the world how much this center means to us. We rally support, we tell our stories, and we make it clear that this community will not be pushed aside." As the meeting ended, Mrs. Bennet watched as the once anxious faces now glowed with a new sense of purpose. They had a long road ahead, but she knew they would face it together. In the weeks that followed, the community center became a hive of activity. Volunteers worked tirelessly to spread the word about the importance of the center, while others organized fundraisers and events to rally support. Mrs. Bennet found herself at the heart of it all, coordinating efforts and offering words of encouragement. She was amazed by the resilience and dedication of those around her, from the children who made handmade signs to the local business owners who pledged their support. One day, as she was sorting through a pile of donations, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was Emily, one of her former students and now a successful journalist. "Mrs. Bennet!" Emily exclaimed, rushing forward to hug her former teacher. "I heard about what's happening with the center. How can I help?" Mrs. Bennet's eyes widened. "Emily, it's so good to see you. We could definitely use your skills. Would you be willing to write an article about the center and the impact it's had on the community?" Emily grinned. "Absolutely. I'll make sure the whole city knows about the amazing work you're doing here." As Emily set to work interviewing volunteers and participants, Mrs. Bennet felt a glimmer of hope. With people like Emily on their side, maybe they stood a chance against Alex Hartman after all. Across town, Alex Hartman sat in his sleek, modern office, reviewing the plans for his latest development project. He smiled to himself, imagining the fortune he would make once the old neighborhood was transformed into a gleaming new commercial district. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he barked. His assistant, a young man named Liam, entered, a nervous expression on his face. "Sir, have you seen this?" Liam asked, holding up a copy of the Oakville Gazette. Alex glanced at the front page, his eyes widening as he read the headline, Community Center fights back against corporate takeover. He snatched the paper from Liam's hands, scanning the article with growing anger. There, in black and white, were the stories of the people whose lives had been changed by the center. There were quotes from Mrs. Bennett, speaking passionately about the importance of community and the power of collective action. Alex crumpled the paper in his fist. "Give me the PR team," he growled. "We need to spin this, fast. I won't let some feel-good story get in the way of my plans." Liam nodded, scurrying out of the office. Alex leaned back in his chair, fuming. He had underestimated Mrs. Bennett and her little band of do-gooders. But he wouldn't make that mistake again. He would show them what real power looked like. The community center was buzzing with excitement. Mrs. Bennett had just received a call from the mayor's office requesting a meeting to discuss the center's future. It seemed that Emily's article had caught the attention of some powerful people. As Mrs. Bennett prepared for the meeting, she couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. She knew that Alex Hartman had connections in City Hall, and she worried that the odds might still be stacked against them. Jasmine, who had become one of Mrs. Bennett's most dedicated volunteers, noticed her mentor's unease. "Don't worry, Mrs. B," she said, placing a comforting hand on Mrs. Bennett's shoulder. "We've got this. The truth is on our side." Mrs. Bennett smiled, drawing strength from Jasmine's optimism. "You're right, Jasmine. We've come too far to give up now." As they entered City Hall, Mrs. Bennett was surprised to see a crowd of supporters gathered outside, holding signs and chanting slogans. Among them were former students, local business owners, and community leaders, all united in their support for the center. Mrs. Bennett's heart swelled with gratitude. She knew that whatever happened in that meeting, she wouldn't be facing it alone. She had an entire community standing behind her. Alex Hartman paced his office, his brow furrowed in frustration. The PR team had been working overtime to counter the positive press surrounding the community center, but it seemed that every attempt to discredit Mrs. Bennett only made her more popular. Suddenly, his intercom buzzed. "Sir," Liam's voice crackled through the speaker. "There's someone here to see you. They don't have an appointment, but they say it's urgent." Alex sighed. "Send them in." The door opened, revealing a well-dressed woman with a stern expression. Alex recognized her immediately. "Mayor Johnson," he said, plastering on his most charming smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" The mayor fixed him with a steely gaze. "Cut the crap, Hartman. I'm here to talk about the community center." Alex's smile faltered. "What about it?" "I just had a very interesting meeting with Mrs. Bennett and her supporters. They made a compelling case for why the center should be protected." Alex scoffed. "They're just a bunch of bleeding hearts who don't understand progress." The mayor raised an eyebrow. "Progress? You call displacing hardworking people progress? You call destroying a vital community resource progress?" Alex's temper flared. "With all due respect, Mayor, I don't think you understand the economic benefits of this project." The mayor leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "And I don't think you understand the human cost. I'm putting a stop to your development plans, Hartman. The community center stays." With that, she turned on her heel and marched out of the office, leaving Alex stunned and seething. He had underestimated Mrs. Bennett for the last time. Mrs. Bennett couldn't believe her ears. The mayor had just called to inform her that the community center was safe, that Alex Hartman's development plans had been halted indefinitely. As the news spread, the center erupted in cheers and tears of joy. Volunteers hugged each other, while participants shared stories of how the center had changed their lives. Mrs. Bennett stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed with emotion. She had always believed in the power of community, but to see it in action like this was truly incredible. As the celebration continued, she noticed a familiar figure lurking in the doorway. It was Alex Hartman, looking uncharacteristically subdued. Mrs. Bennett approached him cautiously. "Alex, I'm surprised to see you here." Alex shifted uncomfortably. "I just wanted to say, I underestimated you, Mrs. B." I thought I could bulldoze this place and no one would care. But I was wrong. Mrs. Bennett nodded. You were wrong about a lot of things, Alex. But it's never too late to learn. Alex looked up, meeting her gaze. I want to make things right. I want to help. Mrs. Bennett smiled. Then let's talk. There's always room for one more in this community. As Alex followed her into the center, Mrs. Bennett felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. A chance for growth, for understanding, for redemption. In the weeks that followed, Alex Hartman became an unlikely ally to the community center. He used his resources and connections to secure funding, to help expand programs, and to raise awareness about the importance of the work being done there. At first, many were skeptical of his intentions. But as they watched him roll up his sleeves and get to work alongside the volunteers, they began to see a different side of the man they had once viewed as an enemy. Mrs. Bennett, too, was surprised by the change in Alex. She had always known there was good in him, buried deep beneath the layers of arrogance and entitlement. But to see it blossom like this was truly remarkable. One day, as they were painting a new mural in the center's entryway, Alex turned to Mrs. Bennett, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, Mrs. B, I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the reunion. About how success isn't just about money. Mrs. Bennett nodded, encouraging him to continue. I thought I had it all figured out. But being here, working with these people, it's shown me how much I was missing. How much more there is to life than just power and wealth. Mrs. Bennett smiled. It's never too late to learn, Alex. And it's never too late to make a difference. Alex grinned, picking up his paintbrush. Then let's keep making a difference, Mrs. B, together. As they continued their work, Mrs. Bennett felt a sense of pride. Not just in the center, or in the community, but in the power of the human spirit to change, to grow, to become something better than it was before. The grand reopening of the Oakville Community Center was a day Mrs. Bennett would never forget. The once dilapidated building had been transformed into a vibrant, welcoming space, filled with laughter, music, and the smell of freshly baked cookies. As she looked out at the sea of faces, Mrs. Bennett's heart swelled with gratitude. There were the volunteers, who had given so much of their time and energy to make this day possible. There were the participants, whose lives had been changed by the programs and services offered here. And there, standing proudly among them, was Alex Hartman. Mrs. Bennett took the stage, her voice trembling with emotion as she addressed the crowd. Today is a celebration, she began. A celebration of community, of resilience, and of the power we have when we come together. She went on to thank everyone who had contributed to the center's success, from the donors who had given generously to the volunteers who had worked tirelessly. She spoke of the challenges they had faced and the obstacles they had overcome. But most of all, she said, her eyes shining with tears, today is a celebration of hope. Because what we have built here is more than just a building. It's a testament to the human spirit, to the power of compassion, and to the idea that every single one of us has the capacity to make a difference. As the crowd erupted in applause, Mrs. Bennett stepped back, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. She watched as Alex took the stage, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a newfound humility. I stand before you today a changed man, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A man who has learned the true meaning of success, of power, and of purpose. And I owe it all to the incredible people in this room, especially to Mrs. Bennett. He went on to announce that his company would be making a substantial donation to the center, ensuring its continued operation for years to come. But more than that, he pledged to be an ongoing partner, to use his resources and influence to support the work being done here. As the celebration continued, Mrs. Bennett found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Because in the end, what mattered most wasn't the money or the accolades. It was the lives that had been changed, the bonds that had been formed, and the hope that had been rekindled. In the months that followed, the Oakville Community Center thrived like never before. New programs were added, new partnerships were forged, and new lives were touched by the power of community. Mrs. Bennett watched with pride as Jasmine landed a job at a local nonprofit, using the skills she had learned at the center to make a difference in the lives of others. She cheered as Marcus's artwork was featured in a citywide exhibition, his talent and creativity finally getting the recognition they deserved. And she marveled at the continued transformation of Alex Hartman, who had become not just a donor and a partner, but a true friend. Together, they worked to spread the message of the center far and wide, inspiring others to get involved and to make a difference in their own communities. But even as she celebrated these successes, Mrs. Bennett knew that the work was far from over. There would always be new challenges to face, new obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that they would face them together, armed with the power of compassion, the strength of unity, and the unshakable belief that every person mattered. One evening, as she was locking up the center, Mrs. Bennett noticed a young woman hovering near the entrance, a look of uncertainty on her face. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Bennett asked, smiling warmly. The woman hesitated, then spoke. "I've heard about this place," she said softly, "about how it changes lives. And I was wondering. I was hoping." Mrs. Bennett nodded, understanding. "Come inside," she said, opening the door wider. "Let's talk. There's always room for one more in this community." As the woman stepped inside, Mrs. Bennett felt a familiar sense of purpose wash over her. This was why she did what she did. Not for the recognition or the rewards, but for moments like these. Moments of connection, of hope, of possibility. Years passed, and the Oakville Community Center became a model for other cities across the country. Its story was told in newspapers and on television, inspiring others to follow in its footsteps. Mrs. Bennett and Alex Hartman became sought-after speakers, sharing their experiences and their vision with audiences far and wide. But no matter how busy they became, they never lost sight of what mattered most, the people they served, and the community they had built together. As she looked back on her life, Mrs. Bennett knew that she had been blessed. Blessed with the opportunity to make a difference, to touch lives, and to witness the incredible resilience and strength of the human spirit. And as she stood on the stage at yet another conference, looking out at the sea of eager faces before her, she knew that her message would always be the same. "Never underestimate the power of a single act of kindness," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Never doubt the impact that one person can have on the world. And never, ever give up on the idea that together, we can build something beautiful, something lasting, something that matters." As the audience rose to their feet, their applause washing over her like a wave, Mrs. Bennett felt a sense of deep gratitude. For the community that had embraced her, for the lives she had been privileged to touch, and for the knowledge that, in the end, love always triumphed over hate, hope over despair, and light over darkness. And as she stepped off the stage, ready to continue the work that had become her life's calling, she knew that the legacy of the Oakville Community Center would live on. A shining beacon of what was possible when people came together in the spirit of compassion, unity, and hope.